The bank was packed by mid-afternoon. Every eye in the lobby had drifted toward the man in the wrinkled shirt and worn shoes the way eyes do when a room has already made its decision. He stepped to the counter and said one simple thing: "I just need to withdraw $50. The woman behind him laughed. She didn't bother hiding it. "50?" she repeated, her voice soaked in contempt. Then the teller looked at her screen, and her face went still. No one in that room was ready for what came next. Stay till the end. The truth behind his account will change everything you think about success. The smile spread slowly, the way contempt always does when it is not trying to hide itself. Scarlett's eyes moved from Nathaniel's back to his shoes, then to Lily, then back to the teller window, and something in her expression shifted from mild amusement to something sharper, the look of a woman who has decided that the situation in front of her is beneath the standard she normally tolerates. "You waited this long," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach the people nearby without quite crossing into a shout. "For $50? Nathaniel did not turn around. He kept his eyes forward, his hands still flat on the counter, his posture unchanged. Only his fingers moved. They tightened gently around Lily's hand. Scarlett let the silence sit for a moment, then pressed it. "There's an ATM outside. You know that, right? Right by the entrance. You didn't have to stand in line for 20 minutes. A man, 2 places back in line, laughed under his breath, not loudly, just enough to confirm that he had heard, and that he agreed with the basic premise. A woman in a yellow blonde Weezer exchanged a glance with the person beside her, the private language of strangers who have decided they are on the same side of something. The teller behind the counter, her nameplate read Jessica, and she had been working this branch for 3 years, looked at her screen with the focused expression of someone pretending not to hear. Lily tugged on her father's hand. "Dad," she whispered, barely audible even to him, "did we do something wrong?" The question landed in the room the way small, honest things sometimes do, quietly, but with a weight that exceeded its size. A few people who had been smirking stopped. One woman near the door looked away. The man who had laughed seemed suddenly interested in his phone. Nathaniel crouched down to Lily's level. He looked at her directly, the way he always did when she asked something that deserved a real answer. And he shook his head once, slowly. "No, sweetheart," he said. "We didn't do anything wrong." He stood back up without rush. Scarlett, who had watched the exchange with the mild interest of someone observing a minor inconvenience, tilted her head. Something about the way he had spoken to the child, the unhurried calm of it, the complete absence of shame briefly confused her, the way a response that does not follow the expected pattern sometimes does. "You know," she said, her voice dropping just slightly, not quieter, but more deliberate, the way a person speaks when they want to be certain they are understood. "People like him really shouldn't waste everyone's time in here." She said it to no one in particular. She said it the way people say things they want heard but do not want attributed. The words floated out into the lobby and landed where they landed. Jessica typed something at her keyboard. Her jaw was set. Her expression had gone professionally blank, in the manner of someone who has heard things like this before and has never once found a way to respond that does not make it worse. Nathaniel said nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his bank card, plain black. No visible branding on the face. The kind of card that carries no particular status signal, and set it on the counter. "Whenever you're ready," he said to Jessica. Jessica took the card. She swiped it through the reader with the practiced ease of someone who has done this motion tens of thousands of times. She entered the account number. Her eyes moved to the screen. And then she stopped. It was not a dramatic pause. It was not the kind of thing you would notice from across the room, but up close from the angle of anyone standing at the counter, there was a half-second where Jessica simply did not move. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. Her eyes stayed fixed on whatever the screen was showing her. Then she blinked and looked at it again. She leaned forward, almost imperceptibly. "Read something." Leaned back. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a note that had not been there before. Careful now, precise, as if she were suddenly aware that her next words needed to be exactly right. "Are you sure you want to withdraw?" "Only $50? Nathaniel looked at her. "That's all I need." "Of course." Jessica nodded. "Just want to make sure." She typed something, then stopped again. Her eyes flicked to the left, toward the manager's office, a glass-walled room at the far corner of the floor where a man in a gray suit was sitting behind a desk reviewing paperwork. Scarlett, whose patience had been thinning steadily since she walked through the door, exhaled through her nose. She had meetings at 4:30 and a call at 5, and the line at this branch on Tuesdays was always inexplicably longer than it had any right to be. "Seriously," she said, "to no one and everyone, what is taking so long?" A few people shifted in line. Someone checked their phone. The ordinary impatience of a crowded lobby filled the air, warm and familiar, and entirely unaware of what was about to change. Lily leaned against her father's leg and watched Jessica with the steady, unself-conscious attention that only children can sustain, without it seeming rude. The stuffed rabbit dangled from her arm. Its one good ear flopped to the side. Jessica typed one more line. "Sit her hands in her lap," and then, very quietly, she picked up the small handset on her desk and made a call. The call lasted under 30 seconds. What was said on the other end of it, no one in the lobby could hear. Jessica listened, nodded once, and replaced the handset with care. Then she looked at Nathaniel with an expression that had completed its transformation. Gone was the careful blankness, replaced now by something that could only be described as composed deference, not subservient, not fawning, simply the quiet attentiveness of someone who understands, suddenly and completely, exactly who they are speaking with. "One moment, sir. My manager is going to come over." Nathaniel nodded. "Take your time." Scarlett made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course there's a manager situation," she said. "For $50. The man in the gray suit, his name was David Holt, branch manager for 11 years, a careful and experienced reader of situations who had handled everything from volatile client disputes to federal auditors with the same metered composure, came out of his office and crossed the floor. He moved with the measured pace of someone who has learned not to hurry in ways that draw attention. He reached the teller station, leaned slightly toward the screen, and read. His expression did not change. It was not the expression of a man who was surprised. It was the expression of a man who had been presented with information and was choosing, very deliberately, how to respond to it. He exchanged a look with Jessica. She gave the smallest of nods. He straightened up and turned to face the counter. The lobby continued around him, keyboards clicking, a phone ringing somewhere at the far end of the floor, the low murmur of two people near the entrance. But something in the air had shifted. It was imperceptible if you were not paying attention, but if you were, you could feel it. The way the center of a room sometimes quietly changes its gravity without anyone saying a word. Scarlett had been watching. She crossed her arms. "Is there a problem?" she asked. David Holt did not look at her. He looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Brooks," David said, his voice even and unhurried, "would you prefer this transaction processed from your primary checking account or from one of your investment accounts?" The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a wave recedes. The conversation near the door faded first. Then the man with the phone glanced up. Then the woman in the yellow blazer stopped mid-sentence and turned. Within 4 seconds, the ambient noise of the lobby had dropped to almost nothing, and the only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system in the ceiling. Scarlett uncrossed her arms. Someone behind her said, very quietly, "Wait." "What?" Nathaniel did not change his expression. He did not look around the room. He did not seem aware, or at least did not seem to care, that every eye in the lobby was now on the back of his slightly wrinkled white shirt. "Primary is fine," he said. Jessica's hands returned to the keyboard. They were not quite steady. "Of course," David said. "We'll take care of that right now." He turned back to the teller station and said something in a low voice that only Jessica could hear. She typed. The transaction processed. The receipt printed. The moment moved forward, the way moments do, regardless of who in the room is ready for it. But the room itself had not recovered. Scarlett Vaughn, who had built a company from a 2-person office in Brooklyn to a $40 million portfolio fund in less than a decade, who had stood across tables from major investors and negotiated without flinching, who had made her reputation on the ability to read a room and understand its dynamics before anyone else in it did, was standing completely still. Her handbag hung from her wrist. Her jaw was slightly forward. Her eyes were fixed on the back of the man in the wrinkled shirt, and they were no longer amused. A person 2 rows back leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered something. She shook her head slowly. The man who had laughed earlier had his eyes on the floor. No one in the lobby was looking at their phone. Investment accounts. Plural. The word sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were still moving outward. What Scarlett Vaughn did not know, what no one in that lobby knew, because Nathaniel Brooks had spent the better part of 6 years ensuring that almost no one would know, was that the man in the scuffed shoes had once sat in rooms very much like the ones she occupied. 12 years earlier, Nathaniel had been a financial engineer at a mid-sized quantitative trading firm in Lower Manhattan. He was not famous. He had not been on magazine covers or invited to speak at industry conferences. But he had been very, very good, the kind of good that other analysts noticed and occasionally resented. The kind that turns routine work into something that quietly outperforms the market by a margin that cannot be explained by luck alone. He built models. He identified patterns in structured debt instruments that his peers had dismissed as noise, and he was patient enough to wait until the patterns confirmed themselves rather than acting prematurely. He presented his findings in a way that made complicated things legible without making them simple, and the people with authority to act on his recommendations had, for 3 years, acted on them. Then he left the firm and built something of his own. The startup, he founded a small quantitative investment technology company that wrote pricing tools for mid-market fund managers, had been in operation for 4 years when it began to attract serious outside attention. 2 early employees held minority stakes. His business partner, a man named Derek who had known Nathaniel since graduate school and who Nathaniel had trusted the way you trust people who have been through hard things alongside you, held 30%. The betrayal, when it came, was technical rather than dramatic. Derek had approached a strategic acquirer without Nathaniel's knowledge over a period of about 4 months. He had structured a preliminary agreement that would have effectively transferred operational control without triggering the protective buyout clauses that Nathaniel had written into their original partnership agreement. It was the kind of move that required patience, access, and the particular cruelty of knowing exactly which parts of someone's trust to work around quietly. By the time Nathaniel realized what was happening, the damage was not irreversible, but containing it had cost him the company. He settled. He walked away with his core intellectual property, his professional reputation mostly intact, and a settlement figure that reflected what the business had been worth at its last formal valuation, rather than what it would have become. He was 32 years old and starting over. He was also, simultaneously, becoming a father. Not exactly simultaneously, Lily was born 6 months before the company collapsed, which meant that the first 6 months of her life had been loud and joyful. The 18 months after that had been different. The 2 years after those had required a discipline that Nathaniel had not previously known he possessed. His ex-wife had left during the restructuring. He did not blame her, at least not in the simple ways that divorce gets blamed. She had signed up for one version of a life and found herself in a different one without being consulted. He understood that. He understood it the way you understand something that still hurts, regardless of how clearly you can see it. He had Lily every day, except 3 weekends a month. Those days without her were the quietest he had ever known, not peacefully quiet, but the kind of quiet that amplifies everything you would rather not hear. He had learned, in the first year, to fill the time with work. In the second year, he had learned that filling time with work was not the same as being all right. By the third year, he had arrived at something closer to equilibrium. A life that was genuinely his, that he had constructed deliberately around the things that actually mattered, and that did not require the approval or the awareness of anyone else to function. He had rebuilt quietly and without announcement. The settlement money went into a diversified structure index funds for the foundation, a small private fund he managed informally for former colleagues who still trusted his judgment, a portion into direct equity positions in 3 companies he had studied with the same methodical care he once applied to structured instruments. He lived simply, not from necessity, but from choice. He had decided, somewhere in the middle of rebuilding, that the version of success, requiring constant visible proof, was not the version he wanted for himself or for his daughter. He wore the shirt he wore because it was comfortable and clean. He drove a 7-year-old sedan because it ran without complaint, and the payments were long finished. He took Lily to the bank on Tuesdays because she liked to watch people and ask questions about them, and because the trip gave them something ordinary to share in the slow afternoon hours before dinner. The $50 was for ice cream. The receipt came out of the printer. Jessica folded it carefully and passed it across the counter with both hands, a gesture she had not made for a routine withdrawal in 3 years of working that branch. Scarlett had not moved. She was staring at Nathaniel's profile, the clean line of his jaw, the unhurried way he folded the receipt and tucked it into his breast pocket with an expression that had traveled, over the past 4 minutes, from contempt to confusion, to something that had not yet found its name. She could not help herself. "What do you do?" she asked. The question came out more directly than she had intended. She was used to controlling the register of her voice, the weight of her words. In 12 years of running a company, she had learned to ask questions that sounded casual but carried freight. This one came out plain and slightly exposed, the way questions do when they are born from something unexpected. Nathaniel picked up Lily's hand. He turned slightly, enough to acknowledge that he had heard. He did not answer. David Holt, who was still standing nearby with the neutral expression of someone who knows exactly what is happening and has no intention of making it worse, cleared his throat very softly. "Mr. Brooks is one of our highest value clients," he said. He said it the way people say things that are simply true without flourish, without editorializing, in the tone of a statement that requires no decoration. The lobby absorbed this. The man who had laughed under his breath was now looking at the floor. The woman in the yellow blazer had turned fully away. The person who had whispered, "Wait," was not whispering anything. Lily looked up at her father with the clear-eyed directness of a 6-year-old who has absorbed the mood of a room without understanding its mechanics. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you tell them?" Nathaniel looked down at her. The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. "Tell them what, Bug? That you have all the money?" He crouched down, bringing himself level with her in the unhurried way he always did when she said something worth answering properly. The lobby waited, without quite meaning to, for what he would say. "Because we don't need to prove anything," he said. "Not to anyone. You understand?" Lily considered this with the gravity that small children sometimes bring to things that turn out to matter. Then she nodded once, as if filing it away somewhere she could find it later. "Okay," she said. "Can we get ice cream now?" "Almost," he said, and stood. Scarlett Vaughn had built her career on forward motion. Every obstacle she had ever encountered, she had moved through faster, with more precision, with better information than whoever was standing in her way. She had never been particularly good at stopping. She had never had to be. But she was stopped now. She stood 3 feet from the counter with her designer handbag on her wrist, and her heels on the marble floor, and absolutely nothing to say that would not make things worse, and she was aware of this in a way that was physically uncomfortable. A tightness she recognized, with some surprise, as the specific discomfort of having been wrong in public. After a moment, she tried anyway. "I didn't mean to," she started. Nathaniel turned. He faced her fully, for the first time since she had spoken. He was not angry. He was not triumphant. He had the look of a man who has had this conversation in various forms many times, who has considered carefully what he believes about it, and who has arrived at a position that does not require performance to hold. "You meant exactly what you said," he told her. The words were quiet. Not cold, just direct. The kind of direct that leaves no room for useful revision. Scarlett opened her mouth. Nothing came. "You didn't laugh at my money," Nathaniel continued. His voice stayed level, without heat. "You laughed at who you thought I was." He let that sit for a moment, the same way she had let her earlier comments sit, except that his landed differently, because they were simply true. And the room knew it. "That's the part worth thinking about," he said. Then he turned back to the counter, thanked Jessica by name, and picked up Lily's rabbit from the edge of the counter where it had been placed, while Lily examined a potted plant near the window. "Lily, let's go." Lily retrieved the rabbit and fell into step beside him, her small hand finding his again without looking. They moved toward the door. Scarlett watched them go. Around her, the lobby resumed, keyboards clicking, the phone ringing, the line shuffling forward, the ordinary life of a busy branch, continuing as if none of the last several minutes had happened. But Scarlett was still standing in the same place she had been standing when she first smiled. David Holt did not follow Nathaniel to the door. He was not the kind of manager who made a show of escorting high-value clients in front of a lobby full of people. It drew the wrong kind of attention and served no one well. But he did step to the edge of the counter, and he did watch through the glass as Nathaniel and Lily crossed the entrance and pushed through the door into the October afternoon. He was still watching when Scarlett reached the counter. She placed her own card down with less precision than she usually did, a small, involuntary tell. Jessica took it without comment. It was David who stepped back to the window. He waited until Jessica had begun the transaction before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was pitched for Scarlett alone. "I don't know if this is relevant to you," he said carefully, "but Mr. Brooks holds a significant equity position in Vaughn Capital Group. He's been a passive investor since your Series B." Scarlett went completely still. Her Series B had closed 4 years ago. It had been the round that let her scale the one that took Vaughn Capital from a credible boutique operation to a firm with genuine market presence. She knew the names of every investor who had participated. She had shaken every hand, attended every closing dinner, personally followed up with everyone who had written a check. She had never met anyone named Nathaniel Brooks. "He invested through a holding entity," David said, reading the question in her expression. "The name on the cap table is Brooks Linden Capital Partners." She knew the name. Brooks Linden had come in quietly, through a third-party introduction, 2 weeks before the round formally closed. Her lawyers had reviewed the structure. Her CFO had approved the terms. The capital had arrived clean and on schedule. She had considered it a professional transaction and moved on. She had never thought to put a face to it. She had stood in a bank line and laughed at him for wanting $50. David excused himself with a nod and returned to his office. The glass door closed behind him with a quiet click. Scarlett stood at the counter for a moment, after her own transaction completed. The receipt sat on the surface in front of her. She did not pick it up right away. She was thinking about a man in a wrinkled shirt who had crouched down in the middle of a crowded lobby to look his daughter in the eye and tell her, without hesitation and without glancing at anyone else in the room, that they hadn't done anything wrong. Outside, the afternoon was clear. The kind of October day that the city occasionally produces as if to compensate for everything else, cool enough for jackets, bright enough to make the light fall in long, warm angles between the buildings, the kind of afternoon that makes people walk slightly slower than they need to. Nathaniel stopped on the sidewalk and looked down at Lily. "Okay," he said. He opened his wallet and held up the $50 a single bill, new and flat, the kind that came from teller drawers. "What flavor?" Lily thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "Strawberry," she said. "And then maybe chocolate after. That's 2 flavors. You asked what flavor. That's fair," he said. They walked. Lily held the rabbit in her outside arm, and her father's hand with her inside one, and her sneakers hit the pavement in the short, quick rhythm of someone whose legs were not quite long enough for the stride she was attempting. Nathaniel matched it without thinking about it, the way people match the rhythms of people they love without realizing they have done it. He did not look back at the bank. He was not angry, or rather, he had been, somewhere in the middle of it, the way you are angry. When something confirms what you already know about how the world sometimes treats people, it has decided to categorize on sight. But anger had never been something he held for long. It came, it was felt, it was finished, because there were better uses for the space it occupied. He had learned that years ago, in rooms far more consequential than a bank lobby, and the lesson had stayed with him. He thought about Lily's question as they walked. Why didn't you tell them? And turned it over the way he turned over most things that arrived from her, with genuine attention, because her questions were almost always more interesting than they first appeared. She had a way of asking the simplest version of a complicated thing, which meant that answering it honestly required more thought than it seemed to. The truth was that he had not told them because there was nothing to tell. He had not been there to correct assumptions, or to recalibrate a room, or to prove that the numbers in his account reflected something about his worth. He was there because his daughter liked to watch people, and $50 for ice cream required a trip to the bank and the willingness to stand in a line. That was enough. It had always been enough. He bought her strawberry first. Unhurried satisfaction of someone who has made a considered decision and is fully committed to it. They sat on a bench outside the shop in the afternoon light. And Lily told him about something that had happened at school involving a turtle and a misunderstanding about whose backpack it had been placed in. He listened to every word. The email from Vaughn Capital Group arrived in Nathaniel's inbox on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the bank. It came from Scarlett Vaughn's personal address, not her assistant's, and the subject line was simply, "I owe you an apology." He read it twice. It was direct and without flourish, an acknowledgement of what had happened, a clear statement of what she regretted, and a line near the end that said she had been thinking about it for almost 2 weeks and had concluded that the apology was owed regardless of whether he responded. She also mentioned, in the second-to-last paragraph, that Vaughn Capital was preparing a significant expansion round the kind of raise that would take the firm to a new level, and that she would understand completely if he chose not to participate. But she wanted him to have the information first. Not because of the money, because she had been thinking about who she wanted at the table going forward, and why. And the answer had surprised her. Nathaniel thought about the email for 2 days. He thought about it while making Lily's lunch, while reviewing his other positions, while sitting with a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning, watching the city move at its own unhurried weekend pace. He thought about the woman in the crimson dress who had found him small, and who had discovered, in 4 minutes, that she had been measuring with the wrong instrument. He thought about what it costs a person to write an email like the one she had sent, not the financial cost, the other kind. The one that requires sitting with your own reflection long enough to see something you would have preferred not to. On Tuesday, he wrote back. He declined the investment not harshly, not with elaboration, simply with the kind of clean refusal that respects both parties by not requiring justification. He held his existing position because the fundamentals were sound and because his investment decisions had never been personal. But he added one line at the end. For what it's worth, the question your daughter might ask you someday is the same one mine asked me. Whether you taught her that value is visible or that it isn't, that's the only decision that matters in the long run. He sent it on a Tuesday morning. Before taking Lily to school. Before the ordinary day resumed. And filled in all the spaces where larger thoughts had briefly lived. He drove her in the 7-year-old car with the radio on low. She sang along to something she had learned in music class, slightly off-key, entirely unconcerned about it. He drove. Respect is the only currency that never loses value. Not because it buys anything, but because it is the truest measure of what a person believes about other people, what they think human beings are worth, and how they act on that belief when no one is checking the account balance, when the shoes are worn and the shirt has lost its press, and the only visible evidence of a person is the surface they present to a lobby full of strangers who have already decided what they see. Scarlett Vaughn changed the way she ran her company in the months that followed. Not dramatically, not all at once. She began to notice who she looked past in meetings and why. She asked different questions when she was introduced to people. She stopped measuring at a glance. Her direct reports, who had always found her sharp and effective, noticed something new in her manner that they struggled to name at first, and then one of them, her youngest analyst, described it in a team debrief without realizing how precisely she had gotten it. She had started listening before deciding. None of them knew what had prompted the change. Scarlett did not tell them. Some lessons are not the kind you explain at a company, all hands. Some lessons you carry quietly, the way you carry anything that cost you something to learn. It had always been that simple. It had never been more than that.